Hey students. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about how writers read. Um, and that's a different experience than what many of you have gone through in your careers as students. In fact, most of your academic life, you've been asked, what about the meanings and themes of work. And it's not that that's unimportant here. We of course do care as writers about the themes and the meanings of things, and all of that's very important, but it's not really how we write. We're not writing with the idea that maybe someday someone in an English class is going to be asked about the Jungian archetypes and what we're doing. And we're certainly not writing with the hope that someone's going to have a quiz on it years later. Most writers are just trying to move people. They're trying to make them care about the world in a different way, to see it in a new and a fresh way. But we do care about our art and our craft and how we compose a work. And especially literary writers pay a lot of attention to the structural elements of what they do, because it is through these stylistic structural elements, their skill set, that they're able to move and connect with the readership. Um, for one thing, we all are conditioned towards pattern. We see pattern, we recognize pattern, and it is through pattern that we make sense of our world. If you think about it, it's not too hard to understand why all of these conspiracy theories get promoted and get recapitulated. It's because we live in a world that we often don't understand, that's difficult to comprehend. And the effect ultimately is that we try to fill these gaps of what we don't know by looking at these patterns and trying to signify what they mean. So and that's its most negative aspect, when we start, not seeing a shadow falling on the moon's surface on a flag the way we think it should, and therefore we conclude that the moon landings were faked, or things like that. And we all go to crazy town pretty fast. But at its best aspect, this is a component of our intellect at work and how we do try to make sense of the world. And all great thinkers think in terms of patterns as a way of trying to understand meaning. And composers understand this. So when we construct things, whether it be a song or a poem or an essay or a short story, what we are trying to do is to use and unlock the patterns that people respond to. So when you read, you want to look for those patterns. I play guitar, for example. I'm trying to learn how to become a better soloist. I'm not very good yet. I still mess up my major and minor scales every once in a while when playing live. But all of those scales, they're patterns. And that's very clear when you're playing guitar. They're literally visual patterns that you can play and you can repeat. And that repetition of pattern can become a very distinctive element of the song. We'll call it one of the ways a song has a hook. So pattern is part of what's compelling and pleasing about a song. Now, if a song is simply repetitious and it's just hammering the hook constantly, well, sometimes that's what we call pop music. And at its worst, it can be just deadening. It just becomes something that is after a few quick hits of pleasure, it becomes unpleasurable. So we want to be able to use pattern, but not abuse it. We want to recognize how it's used well. What I'm going to do here is talk about some different kinds of pattern that you can read for. So I'm going to do a quick share screen, and hopefully be able to find what I've been working on here. Yes, reading for pattern. There it is. Okay. So when we think about reading for pattern, um, the major elements that we're thinking about are the first one that I want you to think about is called productive repetition. Now, all pattern is repetition. And productive repetition, by productive repetition, I'm saying it's not just repeated to repeat, there is a purpose to it. So it's an element of design that is repeated in order to create an intentional effect. And so it's part of the writer's stamp on a work. These repeated patterns create tone, theme, rhythm, style, and contribute to the writer's voice. Tone is created through the repetition of sound and images that create the emotional reality, mood, or atmosphere of a work. A repetition of related images is often called an image pattern. So when I talk about image pattern, that's what I'm talking about. All of these contribute to the coherence of a work. Theme, and now theme in literary analysis is actually used a little bit differently from the way an artist might use it. And there is some blurring, and this creates a little bit of confusion. I'm going to try to clear that up a bit. And again, there's blurring over how we use this, so it's not, there's no cut and dried way to explain this. But theme is generally thought of in literary analysis as what a piece is about or what it means. It's aboutness. An artist tends to look in, when they're thinking about their own work, as theme is a continuous line in the work or among works that contributes to its or their cohesion, both structurally and conceptually. So if I've got 3 paintings and I'm saying they're thematic, they're connected by a theme, that there's a running theme through them, it's not necessarily what the paintings are about that contribute to the theme. It could be color, it could be a series of structural choices that are made. But it's the repetition and how it relates to a work's coherence. And this is both structural and conceptual. For a writer, this kind of theme is created through the repetition of words that share associative relationships. It's the associative capacity of language that makes it the most magical. How one word put next to another word changes both words. And certainly this is how you can make these sort of complex and very subtle metaphorical shifts in a work, is through the associative power. But it's also how we make connections across a work. And again, that contributes to its coherency. Rhythm is a product of repetition as well, and how that repetition affects how words move through time and their recurrent alterations of strong and weak elements in the flow of sound. So Pretty Woman, bum 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 ba da bum 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 ba da. That repetition of sound, actually that was Lucille by Little Richard, but when you hear a song and it has a repetitive riff or bass line, that's the coherent repetitive rhythm that's been established in the work that goes over a period of time. When we talk about this language, it works the same way. When we discuss poetry, we'll talk about meter, but in prose, rhythm is created through the repetition of syntax, which means the repetition of sentences and how we use them. For many writers, how they create a coherent structure using language is a key indicator of style, which, according to one of the characters in August Wilson's Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, quote, ain't nothing but keeping the same idea from beginning to end. This is a simplification of the concept, but it does speak to this idea that style is really about repetition and coherency. How to read for pattern. This is what I wanted to talk to you about today. It's one I want you to start becoming alert to. I want you to start recognizing when things come up, when they come up again, when they come up a third time, and creating a pattern, and then when and where that pattern breaks, and what those patterns mean as they develop. Reading for patterns simply means reading for these kinds of repetitions by taking careful note of the different kinds of patterns created throughout a particular piece of work. These patterns can be lexical, which means the repetition of the same words, syntactic, repetition of the same word order, grammatical, repetition of the same word usage, tonal, repetition of the same types of sounds or images, or thematic, repetition of the same types of words or words that could be associated with each other. So for example, a group of words that could all be associated with prison, or a group of words that are associated with school or church, for example. So if you're writing about, hunting, and you use a whole bunch of words that you associate with religion or church, then then this meaning comes across that you're saying that for you, or for the writer, or for the person experiencing the main character, this is a religious or spiritual experience. And that also creates an internal irony, because obviously in hunting something is killed, but it may be an internal irony that gets worked out through the piece in this very sophisticated and complicated way. When writers read, they should be alert to how these patterns develop and should be very aware of when the patterns are broken, when they shift, and when they change. Okay, all right, so I'm going to stop the share of this one and show you a short story by George Saunders, who's kind of like a very de rigueur, very popular fiction writer right now. He wrote a novel called Lincoln in the Bardo, um, which is um, which is quite important right now. Um, and we're going to take a look at Styx by George Saunders. First time, I'm just going to read it through. And as I read, and this of course is available on your course schedules, take a look at it there. I want you to be aware of the different kinds of patterns that emerge. And then I want to show you how I read when I read, and how, which is not something you have to do necessarily, but it's sort of like a visual representation of what my mind's doing as I'm trying to read as a writer. Okay, Styx by George Saunders. Every year, Thanksgiving night, we flocked out behind Dad as he dragged the Santa suit to the road and draped it over a kind of crucifix he built out of a metal pole in the yard. Super Bowl week, the pole was dressed in a jersey, and Rod's helmet, and Rod had to clear it with Dad if he wanted to take the helmet off. On the 4th of July, the pole was Uncle Sam. On Veterans Day, a soldier. On Halloween, a ghost. The pole was Dad's only concession to glee. We were allowed a single Crayola from the box at a time. One Christmas Eve, he shrieked at Kimmy for wasting an apple slice. He hovered over us as we poured ketchup, saying, "Good enough, good enough, good enough." Birthday parties consisted of cupcakes, no ice cream. The first time I brought a date over, she said, "What's with your dad and that pole?" And I sat there, blinking. We left home, married, had children of our own, found the seeds of meanness blooming also within us. Dad began dressing the pole with more complexity and less discernible logic. He draped some kind of fur over it on Groundhog Day and lugged out a floodlight to ensure a shadow. When the earthquake struck Chile, he lay the pole on its side and spray painted a rift in the earth. Mom died, and he dressed the pole as death and hung from the crossbar photos of Mom as a baby. We'd stop by and find odd talismans from his youth arranged around the base, army medals, theater tickets, old sweatshirts, tubes of Mom's makeup. One autumn, he painted the pole bright yellow. He covered it with cotton swabs that winter for warmth and provided offspring by hammering in 6 cross sticks around the yard. He ran lengths of string between the pole and the sticks and taped to the string letters of apology, admissions of error, pleas for understanding, all written in a frenetic hand on index cards. He painted a sign saying love and hung it from the pole, and another that said forgive, and then he died in the hall with the radio on. And we sold the house to a young couple who yanked out the pole and the sticks and left them by the road on garbage day. All right, obviously that's a really powerful piece, right? And part of it is it's the way it develops this theme. The major theme, of course, is the sticks in the yard, and that's announced by your title. And that becomes a thing that changes over time, but it always comes back to it. Even when it doesn't, it's still, even when it's not there, it's there. It's hovering over the poem, over the piece, and throughout the piece. I shouldn't call it a poem, it's a short story. But as a poet, generally, I tend to think of everything as a poem. That's the lens I perceive it through. And of course, because there's such strong structural repetition going on here, that's part of what I'm seeing as a poet. I'm just going to quick share how I look at this poem. And what I tried to do is create a sort of visual representation of what my brain does as I'm reading. And it might be a little bit terrifying to you, sometimes too much information, right? But here it is. Here's Styx by George Saunders as Joel's brain is functioning. Okay, so one of the things I'm doing as I read, after the first time I read it, I'm just reading it for pleasure. And I'm thinking, okay, well, wow, something's happening here. How does this work? That's my next thought, because I want to be, if I read something I like, I want to figure out how to do it. Much like a musician encountering an incredible guitar solo, I recognize the qualities and the elements of it, and man, and if I'm a writer, I don't say I could never do that. I say, well, how could I do that? how can I learn from this, or as I would like to say, steal from it? So one of the first things I do, being a person who works in language, is I start circling all of what I think are important phrases or words. So that's what you see going on here. Things that strike me. And that initially, there's no rhyme or reason to that. There's no real reason why certain words are bracketed, and other words are circled. But it's just because, for whatever reason, it's to separate different things that I'm noticing as I go. But initially, just very quick, circle, 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 circle. And then I start noticing connections. For example, at the beginning, I'm noticing words that I would connect with each other, like crucifix and Santa and flocked. I don't know why flocked, but Christmas, certainly, Santa, Christmas, crucifix, these words connect with each other. Thanksgiving and Christmas certainly connect to each other in different ways. And then I start doing this thing where I start connecting things. So so crucifix and ghost, now I'm noticing how that could be connected. The Holy Ghost, I'm an Episcopalian, so I can see that. But you see how I've got ghost and died connected, and shadowed and hovered, and ghost and death. And then I've got this triangle between ghost, death, died, shadowed, hovered. That becomes a cluster. And it explains to me a little bit of why the tone of the poem is fundamentally and overwhelmingly dark. Now, there is certainly a tonal shift in the poem as the father changes after the death of his wife, as he moves from words that you associate with perhaps anger, shrieked, harsh, violent words, towards things like forgiveness. But if you look, the crucifix and forgiveness, that's part of one continuous line that runs down throughout the piece. So I'm not going to go through all of this here, except to say, look at all the patterns. If you and you can take a look at these yourself and see probably many connections that I didn't make. At a certain point, all of these arrows, you can't read anything, because they cover the whole piece, and that's how tightly wrought this piece is. It's just incredible. And of course, the writer is alert to these things. This is where, so you get right in the center of the piece. So you have this very dark imagery at the beginning, right, with the shrieking and the meanness. And then you get seeds of meanness blooming, which connects forgiveness, but also connects us back to the crucifix, which also connects us to some of the harsher elements of the piece. If you're wondering why at the end of this piece you feel a sort of longing or sadness, in sympathy for this man, it's because of the way the poem creates this circle, starting with the crucifix and then comes back to this idea of forgiveness at the end. So the father becomes a martyr figure instead of the villain that he begins as at the beginning of the piece. Again, I'm moving very quickly, but this is just one of the ways that I read. It's the initial way. I also read by asking questions. I like asking questions of a piece. So what do certain things mean? And I'm thinking about them. The radio, for example, seems like an outlier in there, but because it doesn't connect to a lot of other things. But then I thought maybe it's about his desperate need to connect, or his desire to communicate, or his inherent loneliness. Anyway, this is how a writer reads. Even if they're not doing this literally on the page, they are mentally searching for and recognizing pattern. And here I'm just talking about lexical pattern here, and thematic and tonal pattern and associative pattern. But I'm sure we could go through this and take a look at certainly there are repeated words, but also different syntax or types of sentences that repeat sort of rhythmically throughout this piece as well, because there is a strong rhythm to this piece if you listen to it read out loud. Anyway, so when we talk about active reading as writers, this is what we're looking for. We're trying to think about how someone else is using the language for effect, and trying to uncover or to sort of bring to the surface these internal, sometimes very obvious patterns that create coherency in a work of art. Hopefully this is somewhat helpful to you in getting you to think about how you should be reading actively, not just passively letting things run through you, but taking that second step or effort reading not necessarily for meaning, but for technique. I hope this was helpful and not too long or too boring for you to get through. I hope you had, I was away this weekend, a trip to Michigan to a farm. All social distancing rules maintained. Please take care of yourselves. I hope you were all well and that you had a great Memorial Day weekend. If you have not done so, please make sure that you take the survey. I'm going to send you an announcement tomorrow to remind you about that, and as well as to remind you of some of the things that you need to be keeping up with as we go. We have an assignment coming up. I need to know what days you can and times you can do the workshop. And I need you all to tell me finally whether or what areas you do not wish to be workshopped in, because I need to come up with a workshop schedule for all of you so you know when you're going to be workshopped. More on that by tomorrow. Today is the 26th of May. I hope this was helpful to you, and I look forward to hearing from all of you if I haven't done so or gotten anything back from you yet. All right, bye.